The canopy frame hummed under his palm. The aluminum tasted faintly of oil and sweat. Instruments blinked in a hard blue as air rushed past the nose, the altimeter calm, the airspeed needle climbing with a small, relentless hunger. Lieutenant Robert Hayes kept his eyes on the little black dial that, for the last 10 minutes, had refused to lie. Numbers creeping toward the edge of what the instrument and the airframe were willing to bear. At 40,000 feet of air translated into speed, and the speed read as possibility, 400, 450, until the needle shivered at a figure a few pilots had only read about in dispatches and rumor. The cockpit smell was a sharp mix of hot oil and high-octane vapor, like a promise. This is the story of how a change measured in octane points, the refining choices, the catalyst shifts and blending tanks, the technicians' late-night reckonings, pulled open the leash on an airframe and let P-51s reach speeds that once seemed impossible. Before we go deeper into the hangar and the lab, stay with this account to the end. If you want the full technical arc and the human stories that threaded through it, subscribe and like so more detailed investigations like this can be made. Your engagement helps sustain the research and the careful sourcing that underlies this narrative. We begin at the bench, where Edward Langley first realized that the numbers on a chemist's chart could rearrange a dogfight's geometry. Langley had the hands of someone who had learned metals and fuels in a machine shop as a boy. Calluses on fingertips, a habit of tapping pipes to hear if they were full. By the winter of 1943, he was senior combustion analyst at a Midwestern research station contracted to refiner partners supplying fuel for Allied fighters. In a windowless lab, under a yellow incandescent lamp, he watched a calorimeter's needle swing and thought, with the sort of quiet astonishment that attends practical breakthroughs, that an octane point change was not an abstraction, but a lever. Octane, as the engineers kept explaining to newcomers in clipped patient sentences, is essentially resistance to uncontrolled combustion, anti-detonation quality. Engines with high compression ratios and higher manifold boost can convert that resistance into power. Give a Merlin engine cleaner, more knock-resistant fuel, and you can safely raise boost. Raise boost and the airplane accelerates, climbs faster, and holds speeds that put escorts beyond the reach of earlier interceptors. That chain of causality, chemistry to manifold to tactical envelope, was the simple spine of the innovation. The complications, however, lived in refineries, storage tanks, and the wrists of men. Margaret Cole ran the refinery complex that received Langley's specifications and translated them into steam tables and shift rosters. Her office overlooked a tangle of pipes that shook with the heartbeat of boilers and reformer tubes. She had been a metallurgist before the war shifted her into process management. She wore a handkerchief that smelled faintly of solvent and the same stubborn, exacting patience Langley had. Margaret's problem was not a chemical mystery. It was capacity, time, and risk. To produce higher octane, what the reports began to call grade 150 in internal shorthand, her plant would have to increase reformer severity, adjust catalyst loadings, and reblend streams. Those steps sounded elegant on a page, but demanded furnace heat across days, catalyst procurement and turnaround, and a resorting of tanks already assigned to contracts and troop needs. Dr. Helen Park, the catalyst specialist, explained the blunt reality in a briefing with maps, curves, and the small, precise gestures of someone used to convincing skeptical operators. Catalytic reforming raises octane by rearranging hydrocarbons, turning light paraffins into aromatics and isoparaffins that resist knock. That requires catalyst beds, platinum on alumina, operating at particular temperatures and hydrogen partial pressures. When Margaret asked about timescales, Helen's answer was technical and humane. A restart of a reformer at the desired severity might take a week of careful ramping, catalyst monitoring, and hydrogen makeup. We can get there, she said, but it's not flicking a switch. Walter Grimes, a process technician with oil stains under cracked nails and a habit of sketching flow diagrams on the backs of ration cards, translated Helen's laboratory conditionality into the plant floor's rhythm. He talked about steam tracing, regeneration cycles that smelled like singed wool, and the squeal of valve seats failing under higher temperatures. To produce the concentrated aromatics that pushed octane numbers upward, the plant had to accept accelerated mechanical wear, more frequent turnaround, and a new protocol for custody transfer. Who signed for which tank, which clerk kept the ledger of blended batches. The blend tanks themselves became a point of strategic importance. To ensure consistency, the refinery instituted sampling protocols that involved Langley's lab in every major lot. On a test bench in the research station, an instrumented Merlin coughed into life under the orchestra of technicians' footfalls. Vibration sensors recorded minute changes. Combustion knock detectors, primitive by modern standards but practical, registered the onset of detonation as a piercing tone. Langley watched the waveform strip light up and thought of engines in the field. Here, under controlled conditions, the grade 150 blends allowed manifold pressure to rise without the telltale erratic spikes of knock. The bench readings suggested a safe increase of perhaps 2 to 3 inches of mercury in boost at specified RPMs, numbers that, translated into true airspeed and propeller efficiency, could add dozens of miles per hour to a P-51's top end at altitude. These were not proclamations, but instrumented suggestions. The team labeled them as measured data and plausible operational extrapolations. We must be cautious where pride or propaganda can exaggerate. The reports were careful. Instrumented after-action readings showed peak-indicated airspeeds approaching, in some tests, figures near 490 miles per hour in specific configurations and altitudes. Those readings were conditioned by propeller pitch, atmospheric density, and calibration of pedostatic systems. They were, nonetheless, real numbers on dials that had been through calibration checks. For commanders, the possibility of such speed redefined chase geometry. For maintainers, it defined spindle and bearing wear that would arrive sooner than before. Field tests brought voices into what had been numbers. Captain Samuel Ortega took a P-51 out one brittle morning with a test card pinned to the clipboard. The canopy seal had been replaced twice that week. The engine responded with a metallic eagerness. "Feels like someone eased the leash," he said later in the mess, a phrase that lodged in Langley's notebooks. On the flight, as Ortega pushed the throttle, the airframe's transonic patches arrived farther aft on the wing. The engine held steady under higher boost, and the speedometer whispered those outlaw figures. Pilots noticed that dives ended faster and that acceleration in level flight matched an attitude of confidence. They could hold higher speed without immediate fear of engine-destroying knock. There was a cost. Sustaining higher manifold pressures and running reformer products with increased aromatic content changed lubrication and combustion residues. Walter's maintenance logs filled with a new shorthand. Higher lead deposit rates in spark plug recesses, tetraethyl lead, still used as an effective anti-knock agent in those days, left combustion byproducts that required more frequent plug inspection. Deposits on exhaust valves changing heat transfer characteristics, and marginally higher cylinder head temperatures under sustained boost. Mechanics learned to check the magnetos more often, to dress valve guides with an attention bordering on ritual. Some components, bearing shells, oil pump drives, slugged into shorter service lives when pilots routinely used the new envelope. The story turned, quietly and then sharply, at an airfield where Eleanor Ruiz, one of the few women test pilots to fly the modified aircraft operationally in the theater, reported a different set of sensations. On a long-range escort run, with her aircraft loaded and tanks near full, she took a climb and found the engine knocking faintly under intermittent boost.
Her quick radio call and feathering of throttle prevented a catastrophic failure, but the incident exposed a vulnerability: fuel contamination. A sampling and lab trace revealed that one blended lot had not met the new sampling frequency required under the accelerated production regime. Water traces from a poorly maintained custody transfer valve had diluted octane in pockets within the tank, producing localized susceptibility to detonation. This was the kind of failure that no bench test could predict, the hydrodynamic accidents of logistics. Anna Morales, the logistics officer whose ledger lines and routing maps governed fuel flows, walked that tightrope between supply and certainty. When the demand for grade 150 rose, her routing plans shortened, tanks were overdrawn to meet sorties, and the single depot that had been chosen for its proximity to forward bases became a bottleneck. Anna's memos, written in a terse hand, show a pattern typical of wartime improvisation: requests for contingency storage, pleas for more sampling bottles, and an accounting of tankers diverted. The logistic chain was fragile precisely because the higher-grade fuel magnified the cost of error. Contamination and misblending could not be tolerated, and yet the realities of war, convoys under threat, damaged railways, and priority shipment orders made perfect custody impossible. At command level, commanders like Marco Silva and Commander Price read the technical reports and spec sheets with a mixture of excitement and caution. For a strategist, an aircraft that could run faster at altitude shifted doctrine: escort ranges, interception windows, the timing of fighter sweeps. Marco saw in the increased speed a chance to hold bomber streams in tighter protective envelopes. Price worried about the maintenance scars such an operational tempo would leave. He insisted on after-action reports that tabulated service life, not just accolades. Strategy and logistics collided in terse memos. Field commanders asked for more sorties, industrial officers warned of wear rates, and policymakers weighed whether to direct scarce refinery capacity toward frontline grade 150 or toward more generalized higher volume grades. The plant floor reacted in its own language. In one night shift, Margaret approved a split of hydrocarbon streams that reduced aromatic concentration slightly to protect downstream equipment, while Helen argued for holding the curve to maximize octane. Walter drafted a temporary fix where blending would take place in smaller lots with cross-sampling. The decision was compromise: increase the number of sample analyses, accept a slightly lower yield per reformer run, and prioritize stability over headline octane figures. That approach kept engines running but reduced the number of planes that could be outfitted with the top-tier blends. It was a strategic constraint masquerading as a production tweak. Tactically, the effect on the battlefield was immediate in nuance if not in drama. Pilots who flew with grade 150 blends in properly sampled lots reported higher sustained speeds and a harder punch in climbs. Intercept geometry favored them. Attackers found they had a smaller window to place themselves behind an escort, and fighters with access to the fuel found they could disengage from unfavorable encounters more reliably by simply opening the throttle. Conversely, if a squadron received mix-lot fuel, its advantages collapsed unpredictably. Maintenance became reactive, and commanders learned the hard lesson that logistics, sampling, segregation, chain of custody were as decisive as horsepower. There were human costs. In a remote maintenance bay, a young mechanic nicknamed Sully in the squadron developed a cough that he and others joked about in graveyard shifts. Inhaling solvents and lead-laden combustion products had a cumulative and unseen toll. No sensational details make this less serious. Rather than dwell on images, the record shows official memos that began to note increased sick days and later the civilian health implications of chronic lead exposure. The technical teams recorded the problem as a hazard to be mitigated: better ventilation, masking, and procedural control over additive handling. But mitigation required resources already stretched thin. The strategic reaction at higher political levels followed a familiar arc.
Industry was asked to prioritize. Margaret's refinery, which had been one of several candidates for a pilot scale-up, found itself receiving both incentives and threats in equal measure. Promises of priority coal and steel allocations if it could raise output, and warnings that failure to meet delivery of mandated lots within specified tolerances could result in reassignment of contracts. The ministry's memos, sterile documents of power, framed the matter as national imperative. But the words masked the logistical arithmetic that Anna and Walter lived. Number of barrels, number of sampling points, transit time, and the human bandwidth to perform these checks. As production increased, so did the complexity of accountability. Custody protocols became around-the-clock duties. Langley's lab instituted a dual sample system. One sample accompanied tank orders, and a second independent sample was retained for backchecks. This diminished the risk of contamination claims, but slowed distribution. Pilots complained, some publicly, some in private journals, about fuel shortages at forward strips, and these shortages influenced the scheduling of missions. In other words, the technical capacity to produce grade 150 did not automatically translate into unmitigated strategic superiority. It exposed supply fragility. The climactic test flight that would, in after-action reports and technical reviews, become a touchstone for the program took place on a clear day when the air was a cold, crystalline sheet. Elena Ruiz's sortie was carefully instrumented, scrupulously monitored. Telemetry, as far as the period allowed, recorded manifold pressure, RPM, coolant temperature, and pitot readings. As she leveled out at the planned test altitude, she advanced the throttle and felt the engine respond with steady authority. The airframe, previously described by some pilots as having a leash, now felt as though the constraints had been eased. Speed climbed again into that outlaw region. Instrument readings suggested a top speed in the high 4s, figures that the squadron's maintenance chief circled with both pride and trepidation in the logbooks. Yet even here, triumph was stitched with hazard. During a high-speed run, one cylinder head's temperatures crept toward limits the manuals had not anticipated for sustained full-throttle runs. The engine did not fail, but readings showed that continued operation at those levels would accelerate fatigue in head studs and bearings. Technicians later found early microcracking in several parts, data that, when fed back into the supply chain, demanded a change in replacement schedules and the stocking of spares. The tactical edge was real. The sustainment cost was immediate and quantifiable. By the time the program widened from tests to operational distribution, the logistical map had been redrawn. Depots that were once peripheral became strategic hubs. Rail lines carrying refined stocks acquired armed escorts and were scheduled with newfound clerical attention. Anna's routing memos became the sinews of the operation. If a single depot was bombed or a key rail bridge destroyed, whole squadrons could be left with inferior fuel and a degraded tactical envelope. Commanders adapted by creating buffer stocks and rotating lots to reduce single points of failure. But buffers cost fuel that could have gone into sorties. The strategic calculus became a ledger of trade-offs: greater immediate tactical performance versus broader long-term sustainment. All of this, bench chemistry, refinery decisions, a pilot's sensory report, a logistics officer's map, combined to change doctrine. Fighter tasking memos began to specify altitudes and sustain speeds that could be held only with consistent access to higher-octane blends. In training write-ups, instructors urged caution. Use higher boost for shorter durations unless assured of fresh lots and clean tanks, read one circular. The language of tactics now included custodial phrases. At Might, in the lab, Langley turned over his notes. He had the satisfaction of a problem made tangible. Instrumented runs that suggested aircraft could approach 490 miles per hour under specific conditioned parameters. He also had in his drawer the maintenance reports and Anna's routing memos that insisted such gains came at a price. He thought of pilots like Hayes and Ortega and Elena, their easy talk about speed as freedom, and of mechanics like Walter, who wrote maintenance codes in a cramped ledger. The innovation had delivered something extraordinary, but it had also reshaped the system that supported it. The last image of the day before the program scaled was of a line of drums under a cloudy sky, their lids fastened, a sample bottle chained to a ledger, and a young clerk stamping custody receipts with a hand that had learned to tremble slightly at the responsibility. The refinery's reformers glowed like a small city, their tubes vibrating with chemistry, and the aerodromes hummed with machines that, for a few more miles per hour, would demand more of the men and women around them. The question that lingered, on logs, in memos, in Langley's margin notes, was not whether speed could be gained. The data, bench, and field answered that. The question was whether the chain that allowed that speed to be acted upon would hold under the pressure of war. The custody protocols, the sampling discipline, the maintenance cadences, and the human cost of increased exposures. The test flights had shown that once the leash was slackened by octane and blending, pilots found an operational liberty. The hangars, refineries, and depots then had to invent ways to keep that liberty sustainable. The program's next phase would not be about proving speed again. It would be about multiplying it safely, about solving for supply. Technicians scheduled extra regiments. Margaret negotiated a second reformer line. Anna rearranged routing to reduce single-point dependencies. Langley and Helen drafted a sampling protocol that required an increase in field kits and training. Each of these measures would consume the very capacity the program sought to magnify. Still, the strategic effect was undeniable. In localized engagements where grade 150 was available and correctly distributed, P-51s could close and open relative positions faster, hold high-altitude intercepts with more authority, and give bomber formations a more confident protective envelope. And yet, paradoxically, as the P-51 slid past the airspeed needles and the numbers glinted on instrument panels, the refinery columns and custody sheets became the narrative's quiet heroes and villains. The most decisive battles were not always fought in the skies, but at midnight in a control room where a clerk decided which tank got the better lot. The story that began with octane points had become a lesson about systems. A chemical improvement could bend tactical reality, but the scale and durability of that bend depended on a laborious and often invisible chain of people and processes. A week after Elena's high-speed run, a frontline squadron received a mixed set of tanks after an emergency rerouting. The maintenance chief's log shows that within a fortnight, average engine overhaul intervals shortened by a measurable margin. An inferred estimate from wartime ledger entries matched by Margaret's production records. Commanders wrote new constraints into sortie planning, and the cycle of adaptation continued. By then, the phrase "leash removed" had spread beyond pilots, mutated in paperwork to a dry operational descriptor, augmented operational envelope. It was no less visceral in use. When a patrol report described an enemy fighter being outpaced or unable to close, the circle closed back to chemistry and the refinery floor. The achievement was remarkable. The cost was visible. The reward of increased speed was distributed unequally. Pilots felt it as a tactical margin, mechanics felt it as workload, logisticians felt it as fragility, and industrial managers felt it as a balancing act between production yields and procedural safety. Night turned the refinery's flame stacks into quiet beacons. Helen stood outside a control room and watched the plant pulse in orange and blue. She thought of catalysts, platinum beads that changed hydrocarbons at an atomic patience, and of how small changes in temperature could alter the course of flights hundreds of miles away. It was a humbling chain. "We must design for sustainment," she murmured, not as a slogan, but as a principle. That sentence, drafted in a notebook, would become a guiding memo in months to come. The tale of the fuel that made P-51s reach those outlaw speeds, speeds reported in instrumented tests and confirmed in limited operational contexts, became a study in systems thinking. It is tempting in retelling to lift the aircraft into the foreground and marvel as if speed were conjured by will. The truer story insists on the refinery's furnaces, on the clerk's stamp, on Walter's practical ingenuity, on Margaret's budget negotiations, and on Anna's routing spreadsheets. The fuel was a technical lever. The war turned on whether the lever had a rope long enough to reach every hand that needed it. The next question, later answered in policy documents and industrial after-action reviews, was whether the state should invest in distributed refining capacity to avoid bottlenecks, or whether concentrating production into centers of excellence would better serve quality control at the expense of supply resilience. That debate was not resolved by any single flight. It was a political and logistical ripple that followed the technical discovery, and it would determine how broadly the tactical edge conferred by octane could be applied. For now, the program stayed in motion. Langley, Margaret, Helen, Walter, Anna, and the pilots kept their places in an unfolding architecture of adaptation. Each log entry, each sample bottle, each tagged drum, and each pilot's notebook formed a ledger of risk and reward. The P-51s, for a time and in particular circumstances, had gained what engineers called a margin, an increase in the operational envelope that translated into numbers on an airspeed dial. Those numbers, sometimes whispering near 490 miles per hour in calibrated trials, reverberated beyond the cockpit into oil-stained ledger books and the quiet conversations of refinery control rooms. They had, in short, found a way to bend chemistry to doctrine. The question that the rest of the campaign would answer was how fully and safely that bend could be sustained when every node in the chain was stressed. The answer would depend less on more tests and more on process, on sampling frequency, on custody discipline, on parts inventories, and on the willingness to accept short-term sacrifices for long-term resilience. It would also depend on the modest courage of clerks who stamped manifests at midnight and technicians who changed seals in the rain. The immediate ledger closed with a complicated tally: tactical advantage in pockets, logistical strain broadly, and a strategic conversation that had only begun. The fuel had proved that chemistry could indeed unlock speed. The rest was work. The story was not over. It had shifted from discovery to implementation, from an engineer's thrill to an industrial campaign. And the characters now had to carry that change into the grinding reality of war sustainment.